Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Kentucky Kernel Podcast, the University of Kentucky Student Award-winning newspaper. I'm Giana Gallo, your co-host, and sadly, our host, Nate Lucas, is unable to join us today. In today's episode, we interview UK media and law professor Dr. Kathryn Montalbano and get her expertise on free speech and discuss UK's history of protests and steps moving forward the university could take. A quick disclaimer, the opinions expressed on this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the opinions held by the Kentucky Kernel. As Nate would say, all right, let's go. I already made a podcast on this topic called Free Speech. So if you want detailed context on the situation on campus, please go ahead and listen to that. It includes on-site interviews and a guest appearance from one of our reporters that's been covering the majority of the story. But if you are not familiar with what's been happening on campus lately, a man that goes by Brother Dean has been organizing a group of about 3 men to spread religious hate speech. Brother Dean's favorite antagonist tendencies include customized t-shirts and signs that read sayings like, "You deserve to be raped," "Virgin pride," and "Women are property." Throughout his group's time on campus, they've engaged in yelling matches where they tell students to repent. Brother Dean seems to have the worst anger issues out of the 3, as he and another student were on video tussling and grabbing at each other's arm. But today's podcast is not meant to bring attention to Brother Dean and his interactions with students on campus, as you can listen to our first podcast for that. But today we'd like to help students understand why he's allowed to speak on campus and help explain UK's tumultuous history with free speech on campus. Today we are joined by Dr. Kathryn Montalbano, UK's media and law professor. She also is the program coordinator for Scripps Howard First Amendment Center. Could you say hi to our listeners?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And you can fill in any information that I might have missed out there about yourself.
That sounds great. I'm new to Lexington, previously taught at App State in North Carolina. Happy to be here.
Going back to last Wednesday, were you aware of Brother Dean's presence and the protesters on UK's campus?
I was aware because of what I saw on Twitter from the Kernel. I was not on campus when it happened. I have seen protesters, is the nature of public universities, but I did not see this particular group in person.
Gotcha. And I guess going right into the questions, could you explain why people are allowed to visit campuses and protest?
Yeah, so public universities are funded by the state, right? They serve the public. So outdoor spaces like the green areas where you see these protesters are considered public forums. Much like a sidewalk or a street, they are open to debate from and by the public. And they are subject to protections against viewpoint discrimination, which just means that government is not allowed to discriminate against viewpoints, even if we or they or the consensus finds it abhorrent or, unpleasant to, even hateful is what some might say was that kind of speech on campus.
Yeah. Do you think that religious speech gets greater protection under the First Amendment just because the First Amendment kind of guarantees freedom of religion and speech?
Mm-hmm. Political speech, broadly defined, does. Religious speech does often historically get swept into that. We have seen recent Supreme Court cases moving more in that direction in recent decisions, with the case about preying on high school public football space, and also the recent decision in 303 Creative, which I'm researching right now, about whether or not a graphic designer has the right to discriminate against customers who are seeking out wedding websites based on their sexuality. So we do see a movement in that direction. Historically, I would say not necessarily. Of course, there are classic cases such as, the right of Jehovah's Witnesses to not be forced or compelled. Right, that's the definition of compelled speech, being forced to speak with something they disagree with. Now, in terms of campuses, this is not unique to Kentucky. Unfortunately, this is a reality that we do see on public university campuses, where you have these, adults who are not part of this, community directly, but they know it's a prime target to try and incite people to respond. So it is an intentional, strategic, I would call PR campaign by, if you want to call them religious beliefs, sure. Like, I'm definitely, as someone who's researched surveillance of religious expression, that was my dissertation and first book, definitely adamant about protecting the First Amendment. But I think there should be, certainly some considerations when we think about the nuances of how we go about this.
Yeah. What is considered too far when it comes to free speech?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we all know the example of yelling like fire in
Yeah.
a crowded space.
Yeah.
But what constitutes hate speech versus freedom of speech?
So hate speech, interestingly, is protected. What's not protected would be fighting words. For example, you incite someone to violence. And I would argue, I didn't see this on the Twitter account, but on Reddit, Lexington Reddit. I love Reddit. I know Reddit's kind of can be a hot mess for some, but I find Reddit so interesting in terms of the exchange of information. There were a couple videos where it did look like they were targeting specific female students, and I would argue that could err into fighting words and incitement to violence, right? So true threats, if there's a true threat, a target, bomb threat targeted to a specific person, that's also not protected. So there are a few other exceptions, but for the purpose of this conversation, those are the two main categories. I would say, again, hate speech is interesting when you compare historically and with other countries. That's not the case elsewhere. So, for example, classic case Germany, the history and legacy of Nazism in that country, there's a very different evolution of what can or cannot be protected in their media laws, right? And so it's not to say that we have it wrong, but it's worth just considering and comparing, the way that free expression and hate speech is or is not protected elsewhere. And these are parallel debates that are going on with digital media policy. If you're familiar with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, so take my class now. I promise this is not an advertisement, right? Whether or not, like, platforms, Facebook, Twitter, they're not beholden to government for regulation, but they're protected under this policy, right, that says, we determine our terms of service, and as long as, we have some good faith efforts to stop illegal activities like copyright infringement, defamation, we're not responsible for what, Peggy Sue in Indiana posts on Twitter if she defames someone or engages in hate speech. And again, hate speech is protected there too. So the question is, ethically, should it be? Something I ask my students as well. We understand if we regulate hate speech, then it could be a slippery slope with government regulating what it doesn't find, suitable to their interests. So it could be corrupted, essentially, is the historic argument.
Yeah. Could you tell me about the rise of free speech zones on campus and why the First Amendment advocates might disagree with them?
Yeah, so I did a little digging into the history in Kentucky. You did have free speech zones on campus. So there are what's called content-neutral regulations, which are considered constitutional if government has demonstrates a compelling need and interest in passing certain restrictions, such as you can protest here, but not after the hours of 10 p.m. or before 6 a.m., and not in this, area that has heavy foot traffic or car traffic. Those would be time, place, manner restrictions, meaning you're not encroaching upon one's actual content. You're just defining parameters for where and when and how. And so this used to be the case in Kentucky until a few years ago. And other states as well have started to ban these free speech zones, which basically would kind of say, okay, you can protest here. I mean, there are pros and cons, and we can leave it up for the listeners to make their opinion. The pros would be you don't have students who are trying to get to class, right, being bombarded with hateful messages that are nonetheless protected under the First Amendment, but you still have the rights to protest. And the critiques of this idea have been, if you look at the historic protests, Vietnam War era, certainly post-Kent State protests, which is what happened here at Kentucky, are we just trying to like hide them away, the protesters that might have something that people actually want to hear? So it's interesting. Again, unfortunately, the pros and cons of viewpoint discrimination or avoiding it would be we have to allow even hateful messages to, exist in the public sphere.
Yeah.
But there are limits, right? You can't threaten targeted individuals. You can't try and engage someone in fighting words and expect them not to retaliate. So there might have been some evidence of that. I haven't seen all of the footage or video, but I think students should know what the limitations are to the First Amendment should they need to pragmatically, defend themselves metaphorically or even just physically, right? Being aware of their physical space and, how to avoid situations that could be dangerous.
Right. And the protest happened right by Gatton Student Center. I call it the bridge on the second floor. And it's for people who do not attend the University of Kentucky and don't know what I'm talking about. There's, going into the Student Center, there's a street right by the ROTC building, and then it kind of goes down a hill. But students have to physically cross a street in order to get to Gatton Student Center. The car traffic is always on a lull because cars really rarely come up that hill. But on occasion there is a couple cars, whether that's maintenance or somebody. Gatton Student Center is a free speech zone?
Outdoor spaces. So you have three kinds of, you have a public forum. You also have dedicated public forum that could apply to certain areas on campus that are indoor. You're dedicating a certain space for a speaker. It's still part of a public forum category, but there's a specific area that's zoned. And that's generally indoor spaces. Again, if you're talking about grass, open spaces, streets, sidewalk. I mean, the historic example of, not so historic, but the Westboro case, right? Snyder versus Phelps, the argument that, this person is protesting outside of a funeral of someone who happened to be a member of the LGBTQT community, and the messages are hateful coming from the Westboro Baptist Church. But again, because of the nature of viewpoint discrimination, we can't, say you can't say these things. Now, the state of Nebraska, and this is where the interesting part comes in, as you could say, clapped back, and they had a time, place, manner restriction on where and when and within certain range you could protest funerals. Again, not saying you cannot spread these hateful messages. That is technically protected by the First Amendment. Hate speech is protected, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective. But there can be time, place, manner restrictions. So, to bring it back to your point, if this space were, in fact, the only way students could get from point A to point B, there could feasibly potentially be an argument that they're held captive audiences, which is a legal term. There are restrictions, for example, in dorms, right? Advertisers cannot engage in spreading leaflets inside dorms because you are physically captive, or the metaphor of a subway. Feasibly, that could be an argument that if students were trying to advocate change for where preachers or whomever would be able to speak, you could potentially think about, and that would go back to the free speech zones, which some people find controversial, the idea that you can only go here, or you can't go here. Those are two different but related things.
Yeah. And going obviously kind of back to the First Amendment, what is one common misconception about it?
About the First Amendment in general? I think just that if you colloquially, when people talk, well, this is my free speech to say anything, of course you've heard the expression, well, you're not free from the consequences of your speech. But there are also a lot of limitations. Look at commercial speech regulation, for example. There's much greater regulation of commercial speech. Of course, we've talked about true threats and fighting words. There are a few other exceptions that have been recently added, like false claims of military valor, like really specific ones. So I guess the common misconception is just that it broadly means freedom to do and say whatever I want, when in fact there are a lot of restrictions. And there's also just more practically a lot of catch-22s, right? We have the right to speak and publish, but there are a lot of restrictions on sources, for example, journalists, that they can actually gather or receive, or access to spaces, restrictions on that, records, et cetera. So I would say that's just a general misconception that it's this blanket protection to do or say whatever we want. And even these, the people that go to these campuses to try and instigate college students, you're all adults, but it's, you're newly minted adults, right? It's easier said than done to say just ignore it, right? And they know what they're doing. They're trying to instigate. They're trying to evoke an emotion. But they do have some restrictions too. If they start targeting individual students and engaging in fighting words, there is an argument to be made, that can be regulated and that can be addressed.
What do you feel like the university should do moving forward if these protesters were to come back?
Yeah. It did look like the police were on the scene. I don't know at what point. Usually universities, you'll have the campus police and you'll have the local police. If it is getting to a point where it does look like physical contact might be made, certainly they should be there. I think also it just might behoove students to be aware of these kind of exceptions to the First Amendment, so they know, like, if they are individually targeted for their race, gender, sexuality, etc., they are aware that there are some limitations, right? In a way, you're students, but it's a workplace environment. You are not supposed to be subjected to sexual harassment, which I would argue some of that rhetoric, discourse, whatever you want to call it, fell under that category. So there are limitations. You're not expected to just tolerate some things that go beyond First Amendment protections just for the sake of, well, we need you to be exposed to viewpoints you disagree with. Sure, that's a great general statement, but when you start looking at the material realities, women, BIPOC students, people, who are being targeted, then we start getting into, okay, well, the context really matters.
Right.
Because it's not just a blanket, yeah, well, we need to hear viewpoints we disagree with. Sure, we do that through your education. That doesn't mean harassment or targeted assault, whether verbal or physical.
Because I know I walked past the protesters on Wednesday, and obviously there was 3 men, but the one I feel like that grabbed my attention was there was a male wearing a shirt saying women are property. And when I came back and I was actually watching what was going on and how, there was a large group of students that were outraged and, voicing their opinion against these protesters, and the man wearing the red shirt just kept saying, a girl would walk by and say property, 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 and would just point and keep saying property. And obviously there was a lot more said from this male, but I think that's where a lot of students got outraged, was from that man just completely starting kind of sexual harassment. I feel
that's where you start to get into harassment and fighting words. I would argue targeting, pointing at specific women. Unfortunately wearing the shirt, so maybe they're not as well educated as they think they are about trying to legally incite anger. But certainly when you start targeting individual victims or individual, however, maybe they don't see themselves as victims, but individual targets, we'll call them, right? Then we start seeing some loopholes to their PR campaign to try and make some whatever statement they're trying to make.
And I know, obviously, again, with students getting so emotional about this and really wanting to advocate for themselves and for others, there was a student who threw a cup of water on the man wearing the Women Are Property shirt. In your expert opinion, what is an easy and kind of quick reminder for students at UK and kind of anywhere on campus to know the difference between free speech and hate speech?
Well, unfortunately, that's the interesting thing, is hate speech is technically considered protected. But certainly fighting words or true threats, there needs to be a clear victim or target, someone who is singled out. So that would be, for example, when we talk about defamation law, defamation, you can defame a person, there needs to be a clear target. Legally, you can't libel or defame a group of people, right? So when we're talking about exceptions to First Amendment that looks hateful, there needs to be a clear target, and it needs to either show a true threat or, more likely in these cases, fighting words. And I would argue there could be a case, again, I wasn't there, but certainly singling out specific women would start to veer into that category of fighting words. But, this is why, unfortunately, like the Ku Klux Klan can assemble. This is why, you can have hateful messages about groups of people. But when you start targeting individual people, which is, it sounds like, and from what I've seen, there was some evidence of that. Again, I don't know the whole logistics of exactly what transpired. That's when you start to have a case that you're going beyond what the First Amendment says you can do.
So transitioning to UK's history with free speech, specifically in May 1970, there were tensions high on campus after the Ohio National Guard fired into a crowd of students protesting the Vietnam War, which you had brought up, at Kent State University, killing 4 and injuring 9. Could you give me your knowledge on the situation on campus?
Yeah, I just read a little bit. I know that more broadly, there was a surge of protests across the country. So one of my PhD advisors, Todd Gitlin, has written about this. He was really integral to the movement at Berkeley. So I know a little bit less about the Kentucky-specific situation and more just in general that this resulted in a lot of protests across university campuses across the country. And this is essentially a nice foil to this discussion because this is what people are concerned about with these free speech zones. The idea that if we look at the perhaps historic relationship between government, broadly defined, of course, government's not a monolith, but I mean, we can talk about the state of Kentucky, we can talk about the federal government, the relationship between government, press, and people. Vietnam really catapulted a major shift, right, in public opinion or public trust in what government does at war. And that includes how journalists mediate and kind of make these events transparent to the public. So events like at Kentucky and elsewhere, I really just show the shift in really not trusting necessarily at face value what government says, whether it's about war or just, foreign affairs broadly defined. So that's one of the concerns if we were to bring back free speech zones, which no one is saying. I'm just saying as, hypothetical, right? If we were to say, okay, the preachers can only preach here, well, would that be a way to try and, stifle voices of dissent against government, right? It sounds, it's a good idea in theory. How would it actually play out if there are certain voices that maybe the majority of students would enjoy hearing, but maybe the government, again, broadly defined, would prefer not to have out there.
Yeah.
So I think Vietnam is an important historic counterpoint to think about what is the best path forward to try and protect students from being exposed to sexual harassment, fighting words which are not protected, but also protects free expression.
Yeah, and since the University of Kentucky is a public state school, would the state create it again, hypothetically, of course, if the University of Kentucky was going to have these free speech zones?
Yeah.
Would the state decide that, or would UK decide that?
The state. So UK must follow the state's order. So like last year, I just saw Georgia banned the free speech laws among 22 other states, including Kentucky, that has banned these free speech zones. This has been more of a Republican-led effort, so take that for what you will. There are different philosophies, when we look at our political system when it comes to regulation broadly defined. And that includes regulation of speech. And parallel conversations going on about regulation of digital media speech. But Kentucky, the state, I think it was SB 17, eliminated free speech zones at public institutions of higher ed, and also HB 254. And this was actually advocated by a former student, right? Helped to advocate this change. So it came from, a fellow student who has since graduated, of course. Yeah, so it's just interesting. I mean, whether you agree or disagree with that, I think it does show the power of student voices to affect change, right?
And what would you advise or, commend students to do moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, we have these so at App State we had similar, not quite as egregious as the signs that, happened here. Some students would counter-protest. Now, there are different thoughts on the heckler's veto, the idea that you're trying to drown out the voice of the speaker. I think it could be certainly justified in these types of cases. That's just targeting people. It's not even progressing. I mean, you could argue, okay, if we start discriminating against viewpoints we think are helping with discourse, then it starts to be subjective, sure. But once students start getting targeted, I think standing together, counter-protesting. We had students who played the bagpipe at App State. Again, easier said than done, right? If you're a woman walking past this, or a non-binary person, whomever that would be affected by this, it's a lot easier to say, be the bigger person and ignore it. So I think certainly allies, even if you're not directly affected by the message, trying to stand strong for people that might not physically or emotionally be able to in that given moment. And it's easier said than done to ignore it because I have time and age on me, right? Where it's like, when I was your age, I don't think I could either.
Yeah.
It's upsetting and rightfully so. But I would say definitely, if police are willing to be more cognizant of certain types of protests that might be leading to targeted fighting words or, true threats, certainly just being ready and communicating with students so that, we can try and protect one another from getting into a situation that might escalate where someone's physical or mental, etc., emotional health is at stake.
Right. I think it was a really powerful scene. I mean, again, I was watching because I was trying to report and, standing next to my other reporters and workers for the Kentucky Kernel. And it was just such a powerful scene to see, so many people, be together and, be allies and try and, fight against these protesters. It was really powerful to see all of those, young student voices try and go against these protesters.
I mean, they want your reaction. It's kind of like when you're a little kid. Bullies want reactions, and it's so much easier said than done. But I would say if you're someone that can stand strong for those who can't, maybe you're a woman and you can stand strong in the face of that, and maybe you can't. Whatever it is, certainly community and support for one another, as you illustrated. If possible, ignoring them. I mean, it's just so sad that these people would. This is what they're doing with their time, It's just kind of pathetic, I mean, quite honestly. But again, it's easier to say that retrospectively than in the moment. It's very upsetting, especially if you are someone that, is personally affected or knows someone who was affected by some of these issues. It's not easy just to ignore it.
Yeah. Do you have any other comments to add or anything?
No. I mean, I definitely, we see historically the argument, again, free expression. We don't want to silence voices that we disagree with. But I think, if you're not a white male, historically, and you look at the scholarship of people who make these arguments, there's something to be said about that. And now we see more women and people of color, BIPOC scholars entering, media law spaces more, and the conversation's changing. And that we see that in, not to say that they're advocating, overturning the First Amendment, obviously, but there should be more nuances and attention to context when we think about these exceptions to the First Amendment, when we think about the material realities of the people who are affected, particularly BIPOC people, women, non-binary people. It's not easy when your physical body, when you're subjecting yourself to scrutiny and targeted assaults, right, based on what you look like. So I will say that, and I think it's interesting to think about that with the digital media policy regulation debates too.
Yeah. And last question for the interview. In your own research, how crucial is it for protesting groups to maintain pacifism in order to get their point across?
To maintain
pacifism?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a definitely strategic move. I went to a Quaker college, and they are kind of, part of it was a secular college, very secularized, but the roots of pacifism, peace, honesty, respect, were still very much ingrained in that kind of education. Egalitarianism, treating each other, with equal respect, regardless of status, and that kind of, I think really, I mean, I did my research on them as well. Part of why they were surveilled by the U.S. government was because they were so committed to pacifism that they felt historically Quakers did not want to be drafted, right? So this is part of why. And also, being open to exchanges with, people who might identify as communists, right? And of course, we know from history the whole Red Scare and whatnot. And that's another conversation for another day. But I think the Quakers are just a really interesting entity because a lot of their ethos that comes from their religious beliefs is really rooted in pacifism. And that has historically been, there are disputes on this. And, if you look at the history of Black protests, right, there's differences in different leaders about the best way to move forward. But I do think when it comes to non-rational speakers, I would say, who are passing off as religious groups, but really fundamentalists, broadly defined, who are just trying to hurt targeted people who are at a vulnerable stage and physical space, they're trying to get to class. Yeah, I would say that pacifism, non-response, is the best strategy because you cannot engage with non-rational speakers. You cannot engage with ideas that are, just there's no exchange to be had.
Yeah. I want to thank you all for listening to this episode of the Kentucky Kernel News Podcast. Again, I'm Giana Gallo. Nate Lucas wishes he could be here, but again, hopefully he will join us next episode. Stay safe, everyone. Make good choices. And as Nate would say, outro song.